Israel, together with the United States, has instituted a new way of distributing aid in Gaza that doesn't allow Hamas to control the system any longer. But of course, the international community, and especially the UN, is up in arms.
And what is going on between Washington and Tehran? Is President Trump going to be duped by the Ayatollahs? Stay tuned.
Shalom. Welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. And as per usual, I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum.
Hi, Mark. I can't believe how much we have to unpack today with everything that's going on. The news is happening so quickly, so let's get right to it. Though I'd like to remind viewers or request of our viewers that they like and subscribe if they enjoy the content. Yesterday, Wednesday, was the 600th day since the October 7th war began, since Hamas's invasion of Israel. And with that backdrop, there have been many conflicting reports about humanitarian aid distribution in Gaza. Most of those reports are false. But let's begin. You tell me what you've heard, especially since you were just abroad, what you heard and what the truth is about the aid in Gaza.
So the United Nations and humanitarian organizations that work with the United Nations have been up in arms about the lack of aid, humanitarian support going into Gaza, and have been highly critical of a joint U.S. Israel plan to supply aid to the people of Gaza. They said it has to be done through the UN and through the organizations that are working with the UN. And here I have to tell straight out that they are wrong in their criticism. Hamas has been running the Gaza Strip since the first decade of this century. And they are an authoritarian regime. In many ways, they're totalitarian because they're an authoritarian regime with a very radical ideology. And they control the population of Gaza with their guns. And the idea that all the humanitarian and UN organizations inside Gaza are somehow independent humanitarians is just incorrect. This is part now of the Hamas structure. All the hundreds, the thousands, the tens of thousands of Palestinians who work for these different organizations have to do so with the blessing of Hamas, which means Hamas controls these organizations. And Israel cannot win this war without defeating Hamas politically. And as long as Hamas is deciding who gets the aid and who it doesn't, as long as Hamas has the ability to take over the aid and sell it at inflated prices, as long as Hamas is in charge, directly or indirectly, of all this humanitarian infrastructure, there won't be a political victory over Hamas because it has the population by the throat, or by the stomach, I should say. And so the humanitarians, or the so-called humanitarians, instead of being against the US and Israeli approach, which is to create an alternative structure to provide it, they should actually be supporting it. And if they've got suggestions how we can do the job better, I'm happy to hear from them. They've got experience, professional experience. But if they're just going to say nothing but the existing UN system, I'm sorry, that's something Israel can't accept.
First of all, I'm not interested in hearing their suggestions since UNRWA, the organization that was originally supposedly distributing aid, is in bed with Hamas totally, and UNRWA employees participated in the October 7th massacre, and UNRWA employees also held hostages in their homes. So, but the worst part about it is, in addition to their being in bed with Hamas, they have the nerve to claim that Israel is starving the Palestinians and that there's famine there. Even the UN had to admit, there was a report recently that there is no famine in Gaza. But leaving that aside, the latest report about the U.S. distribution mechanism, it's a private American company, and Israeli soldiers are safeguarding it. They are not distributing the aid, but they are safeguarding. They're trying to make sure that only civilians and no Hamas terrorists are getting their hands on that aid. And so it took a day or a day and a half to get that organized properly. And in the meantime, the foreign media, was having a field day saying that Americans are shooting at Hamas civilians who are trying to get at the food. It's a lie. There were 2 injuries, but there was there was a lot of crowds of people rushing to get the food. But by the end of yesterday, it was all orderly. There were lines, proper lines, and each family head was given a huge box with something like 3,500 calories per family member for the week, every day for a week, and then they'll return next week to receive their next package. And the whole idea was to prevent Hamas from getting its hands on it. And Hamas all week, by the way, was telling Palestinians, if you take the aid, we're going to kill you. And in fact, they did execute a few of the civilians there. And meanwhile, Israel is being vilified for all of this. Now, the fact that there's any aid altogether was going to be a problem because since Hamas was stealing it, it was prolonging the war. It was preventing hostages from coming home. Now this mechanism seems to be working. Now, but here is, I think that we need to discuss as we move on, how this impacts the Trump administration and Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, and the whole hostage release, so-called ceasefire negotiations.
So I would say the following, Hamas is against the new way of delivering aid because they don't control it. And though, you'll get all these UN people who are parroting that position, if we want a better future for Gaza, if we want a better future for Israel, right, Hamas can't remain in power. And people need to understand Hamas's control, once again, directly and indirectly over the humanitarian aid going into Gaza is its lifeline. And no one should be surprised that Hamas is so angry. In fact, apparently behind the scenes in the negotiations, they are demanding, as part of any sort of deal for a temporary ceasefire and to get the hostages out, that the networks that we've established with the United States to provide humanitarian aid, that be abandoned in favor of the old network. And I think everyone of goodwill who's watching this show should ask, why is Hamas demanding that the American-Israeli approach be abandoned? It's clear, because they know that's a real threat to their continued political control over Gaza. And once again, this will only be over. The war's aims are to end Hamas's rule over Gaza, because if you don't do that, you said at the beginning, 600 days to the war, we're back to day one. We're back to day one, and we're just going to wait for another October 7th massacre. It's crucial that when this is over, Hamas is no longer in power in Gaza. And for that to happen, we have to take Hamas away out of the delivery of aid to the people of Gaza, because as long as they control that, they can control the population.
Well, which is why Witkoff's latest plan that was leaked, if the details are accurate, which we can't say for certain, but the Israeli journalist Amit Segal, who reported on it, is very reliable generally. So we can't state this as fact until Witkoff himself acknowledges it. But it sounds like a terrible, terrible plan, because in it is not only an extended ceasefire and a release of only some of the hostages. There are 58 hostages there. We know for certain, apparently, that 20 of them are alive, maybe 24, and the rest are dead bodies. But Hamas is already now taking charge of these negotiations, demanding this many prisoners, demanding that it determine which hostages it returns, and that the UN resume taking control of the humanitarian aid, as you pointed out, an extended ceasefire, etc. And after which, and a withdrawal of Israeli troops from areas that are crucial, that if Israel abandons those areas during a ceasefire, it's all finished. In other words, this plan would basically mean that Israel is ceding the war, is losing the war, and that can't happen. And it's very, very disappointing that that's coming from an otherwise sympathetic Trump administration. That is sympathetic in the sense that it never once has blamed Israel for the situation in Gaza. Trump has been very clear that the October 7th massacre was the most horrible thing he's ever seen, and videos of it, etc. He's never said that Israel is at fault for harming the Gazans. None of that. However, if the art of the deal involves allowing those terrorists to behave as though they are on a par with Israel, like another country, and these are just regular negotiations, well, that's a huge mistake. And I really hope that Prime Minister Netanyahu will reject it offhand. I mean, first of all, if he accepts this plan as it's been spelled out this morning, I think that his government will fall. And that's less important. The government falling is less important than winning the war and rescuing the hostages, for sure. But the point is there will be a big mess. And if he doesn't accept it, then he runs the risk of going up against the Trump administration and also bringing the wrath of all the leftists in the world on his head.
So over the last few days, we've been receiving actually positive news from the Gaza battlefield. We've spoken already about this new system to deliver aid, which avoids Hamas and Hamas's control, and it's successful. It still needs to be developed. Obviously, it's work in progress, but we have a pathway here where civilians in Gaza can receive aid not through Hamas or its surrogates. And at the same time, Israel has had battlefield successes. We've been taking out terrorist leaders. We've been moving our forces into areas. Hamas is under military pressure. So the military pressure from the ground operation, together with the political pressure from taking away their oxygen in the framework of humanitarian aid, Hamas is under a lot of stress, and it's one of the reasons maybe that they've come to negotiate now and finally make some sort of deal. What the dilemma facing the Israeli government is, and it's a tough one, because the Israeli government, one of the war aims is to get the hostages out. What price do we pay to get? Obviously, Hamas isn't offering them all, and I don't think if Hamas would ever offer them all because they want to hold the hostages for them. You know, it's a human capital for them, right? They know how we in Israel value and cherish human life. On the other hand, if we can get half of the hostages out, close to half of the hostages out, of the live hostages out, which appears to be in this deal that's been reported on, I don't think we can sign on the bottom line and pay any price, but I think it's probably worth paying a price. I think we'd have to be very careful on any military redeployment. And I think we'd also have to be very careful on accepting a Hamas demand just to go back to the UN system, which allows them to reassert their political control. We've seen over the last few days increasing signs that the population of Gaza is fed up with Hamas. It's not because they like Israel. I'm under no illusions. So you can find the odd video of someone in Gaza saying, good on you, Netanyahu, good on you, Trump. Yeah, but I've got no illusions. They are fed up with Hamas because Hamas has brought nothing but death and destruction upon the people of Gaza. And the people of Gaza would want something else. A ceasefire gives Hamas time not only to rest and recuperate, it gives Hamas time to reassert its control over Gaza and over the population of Gaza. And so the government of Israel has to think very, very carefully the pros and cons. Of course, we want our hostages out. On the other hand, we've got to win the war, and to navigate between those two goals is sometimes very difficult.
Well, you know, you're absolutely right. We have to pay a price, and we were willing to in a previous Witkoff proposal, and Hamas rejected it. Now, everything you said would lead a normal person to say, okay, Hamas is weakened. Its leadership has been completely destroyed. The Gazans are fed up. Everything you mentioned means that Hamas is breaking. Is that the time to give in to Hamas demands? Absolutely not. And the author of The Art of the Deal, of all people, should know that. Now, it is true that Witkoff said yesterday during a press conference that he has this new plan, a term sheet, I think he called it, and he said that President Trump is going to review it. So as of this taping, we don't know what President Trump thought of what he read, or whether this what Amit Segal reported is correct. But if it is correct, it is a disaster. It is resuscitating a dying Hamas. Now, when you say we need to get the hostages out, of course, and we're willing to do everything we can to get them out, but doing these kind of things doesn't guarantee that we get them all out. On the contrary, it guarantees that Hamas then has time to hide them better, has time to let many of them die in the meantime, has time, as you said, to recuperate, has time to terrorize the Gazans rather than into even helping Israel find the hostages, or into defeating those terrorists. It just brings us back to the previous situation. It will mean that all the soldiers who were killed in battle died in vain. It will mean so many bad things that it's, I'm just really concerned about it. And as much as I am, and I have been saying that I don't believe that the rift between Washington and Jerusalem is as bad as, the mainstream media likes to portray it. And I mean that as well. But I think that the Trump administration is totally misguided on this point.
So we'll have to see how this plays out. And if you're in the Israeli Security Cabinet, it's not an easy decision. Hamas is weaker, for the reasons that we've said, than any time since October 7th. And we have to wait to see, do you exploit this weakness to get the best deal possible to get hostages out, or do you continue to hit Hamas and hit Hamas hard and hopefully get more hostages out in the future? I don't have all the information. The members of the Security Cabinet will be updated on the latest intelligence. It's a tough one. It's a tough one. And then once again, as you said correctly, we don't know whether what's been reported, what are the parameters of the deal, actually is the deal. We have to wait and see. There's a parallel with Iran, if you'll allow me. Iran is also at an unprecedented point of weakness, maybe at the weakest time in recent history. Their economy is falling apart, right? The sanctions are really taking effect. I understand there are water shortages, and there is electrical shortages in Iran, and people see what the value of their currency is worth. There's no economic future for the Iranian people in the current situation. And at the same time, militarily, their proxies in Syria and in Lebanon and in Gaza have been all totally annihilated or greatly weakened. And so their axis of resistance, what they call their terror armies, their terror proxies, are nowhere as strong as they were, let's say, this time 2 years ago. And secondly, because of Israel responding to their air attacks, we've crippled their ability to defend themselves from our air attacks, because we've taken out their anti-aircraft and their radar. So Iran is negotiating now with the United States, also under unprecedented weakness. And you have to ask the following question: is this the time, as President Trump says, to try to get the best deal possible because they're weak and they need the deal now more than ever before? Or is this a time to actually finally take military action and to take out their nuclear program once and for all?
Well, again, we use the word deal. I would prefer the word dictate. The greatest superpower in the world should be dictating to this weakened Islamist regime. It should be dictating the terms, not negotiating a deal with terms. And that is already, the whole mind frame is wrong. Now, it is very possible. Trump has said repeatedly, look, I'd prefer not to have bombs flying. I'd prefer not to have anybody killed, and I prefer to do it the nice way, where they destroy their own facilities, or we, have mechanisms to make sure they're not enriching uranium, etc. Or we'll have to do it through violent means, he said. But he also said yesterday in a press conference that he had told Prime Minister Netanyahu that it would not be appropriate for Israel at this time to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, because it would it would harm these negotiations. And I think, again, it's that he's mistaken to have said that to Netanyahu. I think what he should do is be telling Iran, look, guys, the clock is ticking, and if you don't like it, Israel is ready to attack, etc., rather than say, Israel, hold off. Now, still, it's not a hostile. He hasn't been hostile to Netanyahu the way Biden was. He didn't. He said, just do me a favor, basically. And I think Netanyahu said, okay. And the question is whether Iran will manage to pull the wool over America's eyes. Trump swears that he is not going to be duped by them. But so far, it's looking, given his statements about how he's optimistic that a deal will be reached, that doesn't sound good to me. All right? Now, so the question is, will Netanyahu launch a strike when he deems that it's necessary, even if the Trump administration is not ready for that to happen yet? Not likely, is it?
So, of course, Israel has to take into account the wishes and desires of its most important friend and ally in the world, which is, of course, the United States. You can't just ignore if the Americans have preferences. It doesn't, at the same time, mean that we have to do whatever America says. Of course, we have to take into account what they think. But if we think our national security, our existence is threatened and there's a unique opportunity to take action. When Israel bombed Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor in 1981, famously, we were condemned by the Americans. I think now everyone in Washington, almost everyone in Washington, agrees that Israel did a very good thing. What would the Second Gulf War have looked like had Iraq had nuclear weapons? It would have been a totally different ballgame. Israel also took out the Syrian nuclear reactor. Was that what? That was 2007. And once again, I'm not sure the Americans were necessarily against it, but they wanted no part of it. They said, if Israel does it does it on its own alone and maybe faces the consequences alone. But once again, in both cases, Israeli prime ministers understood that the Americans were not giving full support, and yet they decided there was a need to act. And you could have something similar today, but once again, Israel would have to think through that very, very carefully. I think we had a question from one of our viewers.
We did. And here's where I will reiterate the email address for anybody who would like to send us questions that we can, if we can, answer them on our broadcast. The email is undiplomatic@jns.org. And I apologize to anybody who tried last week unsuccessfully to reach that address. It has now been rectified. Well, I'm going to read just one because this one was an actual question. Jim from Texas, he calls himself. And the question is this: just what did you guys do to them to warrant such anger? He means, what did Israel do to Iran to warrant such anger? As an American from the baby boomer generation, the number 444 has a special meaning. He's referring to the 444 days that U.S. diplomats were held in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979. Iran went through a major transformation in 1980, he says, which radically changed U.S. relations. Its current Islamic zealot leadership has had a couple of generations to control the population and perpetrate an anti-Semitic agenda. Wouldn't an attack on Iran by Israel drive infuriated Iranians to fiercely support their extremist rulers even further? Maybe that's what the Iranian leadership would like. Well, it's an interesting question.
So can I first of all answer the first part of Jim's question, Jim from Texas, and say, he asks, what did Israel do to get the Iranians so mad at us? And the answer is, well, not much at all, because we used to have a very good relationship with Iran under the previous regime, under the monarchy. We had cooperation in all sorts of areas. El Al planes used to fly in and out of Tehran, Israel's national carrier. I myself was once on one of those planes, visiting Iran as a young boy. To paraphrase what a famous American political axiom, it's the economy stupid. So if you want to understand Iran, it's the regime stupid. Jim, I'm not calling you stupid, I apologize, but I'm just saying it's the regime. When that regime came to power, basically it was an extremist Shia political sect that took over what was ultimately a great country with a great history. And their attitude was strident anti-Americanism and strident anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism as well. And it's all about the nature of the regime there that has caused the tension. Israel and Iran had a good relationship in the past. We could have a good relationship in the future. The reason for the hostility, once again, it's the regime.
Well, no, he acknowledges that, but he says after generations of indoctrination by that regime. Listen, it's like the Gazans. They've been indoctrinated. The Palestinians have been indoctrinated for decades by their hateful leaders. So his question is valid. If they have been, if the regime has had such a stranglehold on education as well, then the population is brainwashed. And if the population is brainwashed to be anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, all of those anti-Western, how do we know that an attack wouldn't then cause the people to rally around the regime? Now, it's a good question. The answer is, though, that the Iranians, unlike the Palestinians, they have had a whole culture, a very rich culture before this regime took over, of independent thinkers, for example. Also, as you mentioned, the economy, they have been growing increasingly fed up with the regime. Women feel subjugated. Everything there is so that the Iranians, the educated ones, long for the old days. There were women in miniskirts in Tehran, now, but it is a good question because it is also true that Bernard Lewis, the late Bernard Lewis, famous Middle Eastern scholar, did say decades ago that there was a danger of that, of the Iranians rallying around the regime. But I think that based on the protest movements in Iran, the growing protest movements, that of course the regime, guns down, etc., but I think we can see a real crack in that armor. And the Obama administration ignored it, and Biden administration ignored it. In other words, it's not that toppling the regime should come from the outside. It's that they need support. And this would be a perfect opportunity. And I'm really, again, I'm hoping that President Trump doesn't fall for some kind of imaginary, because, he keeps using the word peace, or saying we'd like a resolution to this so that the Iranians can live in prosperity or whatever else it is. No, they can't with that regime in power. They just can't.
You spoke about indoctrination, and you've got a population in Iran that is, over the last decades, receiving this sort of Islamist, anti-Western, anti-Israel indoctrination the whole time. And one can say, some things won't change if the people are brought to hate, as we see in Gaza. But as you also said correctly, Iran is a different country with a very rich history and heritage and culture and levels of education and so forth. And I'd remind you, there was decades of communist indoctrination in countries like Poland and Hungary and Romania. And suddenly when the Iron Curtain fell, there weren't a lot of communists, not in Poland, not in Bulgaria, not in Hungary, right? When there's a hateful regime giving the official line, right? But the regime is hated, people don't necessarily believe it. And once again, you had democratic elections in Poland after, 30, 40 years of communist control? No one's voting communist. And so the regime in Iran is hated by much of the population. And I'm not sure that indoctrination has to count. He does ask, Jim, but if you attack Iran, does that not rally the population behind the government because of external attack? If you were started carpet bombing cities, maybe. But if you're surgically hitting targets in Iran to do with the regime, to do with the Revolutionary Guards, to do with its nuclear program, I think the Iranian people would not necessarily turn against Israel or the United States. If you hit symbols of that hated regime at its power, like the nuclear program, I think you might get a very different approach from the Iranian people, not necessarily a rallying behind the regime. If you ask Iran, would they like their country, Iranians, if they would like their country to have nuclear bombs, maybe many of them would. They'd like to be a great power and so forth. If you ask them, would they like their regime, the Ayatollahs who oppress them, to have nuclear bombs, I think that you'd get a very different answer.
Yes, well, in fact, there are many Iranians. We've seen this all over the place. There are many Iranians who have been screaming death to the dictator, etc. And I'm not sure they care so much about nuclear bombs. I think that what they want is a different kind of power. And ironically, if there were a different kind of regime in power, it would be less important for it not to have nuclear weapons. Okay. But there we are. And what's more, it's a regime that threatens, it's not just Israel and it's not just Jews. It's America is the great Satan. Israel is the small Satan. That's what they say. They're against the West. They're against Britain. So it's amazing to me that anybody in the West thinks that it's possible to deal with them. And I'm also disappointed in Trump for the following thing, is that he was the one who ripped up Obama's disastrous nuclear deal, and he ripped up the 2015 nuclear deal in 2018. And now I'm just hoping that he isn't going to do a repeat under a different name of the JCPOA. I really hope. I mean, I trust that he doesn't believe that Iran is a good regime. It's just the language he uses is a little bit disturbing.
So, you said before, and it's correct, right? The Iranians aren't a normal country. It's like there's a difference if a democratic country has a nuclear weapon, like that France has a nuclear weapon. Does that threaten global security? But when North Korea gets a nuclear weapon, everyone's concerned. And it's the same with Iran. Iran, unfortunately, as Kissinger famously said, Iran has to decide if it's a country or a cause, and the cause being the Islamic Revolution. So far, they've decided to be a cause. And as long as you have this radical ideology in this regime, the nexus, the marriage between weapons of mass destruction and that totalitarian extremist ideology, that's a very dangerous message. And as you correctly say, it doesn't just threaten Israel. It threatens Israel's Arab neighbors. It threatens the whole world. And the best answer to this question is Iran already has missiles that can reach Israel. Why are they working on a future generation of long-range missiles that can reach targets in Europe and maybe even the United States, if their ambitions are only regional? And that's why Americans should be thinking very carefully about tolerating any sort of nuclear program in Iran. I think we're coming to the end of our time, Ruthie.
Well, and let's hope that by our next broadcast, we will have better news, and including about the hostages. Again, they've been in captivity as of today, 601 days. That is unfathomable. 601 days of starvation, of beatings, rapes, all kinds of horrible things going on there. And we are desperate to get them back. But to do that, we need to defeat their captors.
And we'll continue this discussion when we meet again next week, Ruthie, and I look forward to that.
So do I.